So in the last video, we got our save menu set up, as well as our basic menus. So we've got our config menu there as well, although we didn't create the functionality for it. It's just there in place. We can't even switch between our tabs. All we have is the general layout. But our save and load menu is working, and our help menu works, which means all that's left is to do the config menu, and of course the home, which would take us to the main menu, and quit, which would exit the game. So let's start with the config menu today. So to get to our config menu, so that way we can edit it, let's make sure that it's visible so we know what we're doing. Our root controls the main visibility, so I'll make sure that that is 1. And then I just want to make sure that my config menu is set up. So I'll go ahead and just hide the save and load menu. And the content of the config, I'm going to set to 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and take care of this. Actually, let's re-enable save and load, but let's change its content to 0. So our config menu, just like our save and load menu, is a type of menu page, and we already created its script in the last episode. So let's just go ahead and open that one up. Now this config menu can have different pages for it depending on the different settings that we want to apply. For me, I've created general and audio, which each have their own object inside of this panel selection, or inside of the panels here. We have the general and the audio, which are basically their own game objects with different scroll views. Now, if we want to enable pages and hide other ones and keep track of what pages open, then we're just going to, I think we'll do this by keeping track of the game objects as our config panels, and we'll make that accessible inside of the editor. So we'll make a serialized field private, and we'll go with a game object array for our pages or panels. And then we'll just have a private game object for the active panel. So on start, we want to make sure that all the panels are invisible except for the very first one, which would be our general panel. So let's go ahead and loop through the panels that we have. And we're just going to do this with a basic for loop through each of the panels and say that panels i.setActive only to be true if I equals 0. So we only set the first one active. And then we'll go ahead and make sure that the active panel equals panels 0. Now I also want a way that I can call off the buttons on the UI that will reveal a panel. So let's go ahead and make a public void for show, or maybe we'll do open panel, and we'll take a string for the panel name. When we call for a panel to be found, we should search through this panel list and figure out which one matches if there's any. So let's make a temporary cache for the panel. So we'll find this panel by saying panels.first, and we're going to look for a panel where the panel.name equals the panel name that we've passed in. Now, if we did not find the panel, then let's go ahead and log a warning and exit. That warning can just say we did not find a panel called the panel name in the config menu. For case insensitivity, you can go ahead and convert these to lowercase as well to make the check not case sensitive. However, if we did find the panel, then let's go ahead and make sure that it's active. So panel.setActive true. And if we had a current active panel open and it's not this panel, we need to disable it. So if active panel is not equal to null, which it shouldn't be, and our active panel is not equal to panel, then active panel.setActive false. So if we come to our config menu and expand the panels, we can drag in from our panels object the general first, because we want that to be the default, and audio second. I can then come to the panel selection header, choose my general and audio buttons, and then come down, create an on-click event, drag in the config menu, and select that function from the config menu, which was called open panel. Now the general is going to open the panel called general. Make sure we spell it right, otherwise it's not going to work. It needs to be the name of the panel that's listed down here. because that's how our check is operating. And the audio button is of course going to open up the audio panel. And before I forget, after we set our active panel, let's actually do that after we disable the current active panel. Let's go ahead and set the new panel, and then say active panel equals panel. Otherwise, we're going to have some issues when we try to switch between panels because we're not updating the active one. And so we should be able to activate our panels and see the different options for us. Since we have root visible, we just need to make sure that the canvas group is down to 0, and then we can click config. Brings us to our general tab first. Our buttons are usable. And we can click audio. Now we have our audio settings, and go back to general, back and forth, and we can navigate. Now on start, one thing I'd like to do is set our available resolutions. Right now, I've only got one option, which is 1920 by 1080, and that's it for the dropdown. I need to populate this with several different resolutions that we would want to be available for the visual novel. Now, finding the resolutions is simple enough. We can simply create what's called a resolution array, and this array can just equal screen.resolutions. And that actually gets us all of the resolutions that are available for the monitor that's being used. But to add this to our dropdown, we're going to need a reference to that dropdown first, and we're going to need to convert this into a string array with width and height. Now, we're going to want a reference to all of these different UI objects for the buttons, the drop-downs, and the sliders for every panel, because we're going to need to not only reference those and reference any changes, maybe change some content, change some colors, but also on load, when we reload our configuration file, which is going to save these settings, we want to be able to set them back to the right positions and the right colors and whatever. So we're going to want a reference to all of the UI objects, and we can do that very easily in a subclass of our config menu. So down at the very bottom, let's go ahead and create a system.serializable class. And this will be just called the UI items. Now up at the top, we'll go ahead and reference this as we'll do a serialized field, private UI items, and we'll just call it UI. Now what we're going to have in here is a different header for each section just to organize things. I'll say a header for general, and also I'm going to have a header for the audio, which are my two different panels. And this header simply puts a little string up above all the variables that are underneath it inside of the inspector window. That way we can really see a different segmented part of the inspector and categorize our variables. So for our general tab, let's go ahead and make sure we're using the Unity Engine .ui namespace so we can have all the UI objects. And we need a button for our full screen and our windowed button. So public button. So we're going to have full screen and windowed. And then we're going to have that drop down that we were looking at. Public drop down resolutions. For our audio, we're going to have a public slider, and this will be our music volume. We also had one for our sound effects and our voices, so SFX volume and voices volume. I believe we also had one for ambience. Nope, just music, sound effects, and voices. But on our general tab, we've also got continue skipping and stop skipping, as well as the text and the auto reader speed. So I'll go ahead and add that in general as well. So button, continue, or skipping, continue, and skipping, stop. And then public slider, architect, speed, and the auto reader speed. And if we look at that in our inspector, we can see that we have all the different buttons. Only I've got the general header twice because apparently it identifies both full screen and windowed. Since they're both on the same line, it gives them the same header. Since that's not what I want, I'm just going to separate these into different lines. But there, now I can go through into the general section, scroll view, viewport, inside of the content, and the left column where all of these things are, and go ahead and start grabbing the different options and assigning them inside of our config menu. If you want to lock this inspector down so it doesn't go away while you're clicking through objects, you can go ahead and click on the lock here. Just make sure the lock is visible when you want this panel to stay active, and unclick it when you want it to go back to following whatever you're clicking on. So I'm going to go ahead and lock that down, and then I'm going to take my display object. My button 1 is full screen, I believe. Just so I can see what I'm doing, I'm going to right-click Inspector and choose Add Tab and make another Inspector window. And this one will be at the bottom where I can see exactly what I'm looking at. So that is the full screen button. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this into full screen and this into windowed. Then to the resolution, the drop-down is going to be the resolutions drop-down. However, that is actually, if we look at it, this is a TextMesh Pro dropdown, so we need to change that just a little bit. Instead of using a regular dropdown, which is Unity's default, we can go with a TMP dropdown. And then that will allow us to add TextMesh Pro's dropdown to our objects. Now, the skip behavior, the first button is to continue skipping after a choice, and the second one is to stop skipping. So let's go ahead and assign the rest of these and then continue on. Now we have a drop-down to assign our resolutions to. So let me go ahead and make another function, which is going to be a private void called set available resolutions. And on start, after we get our active panel, I'm going to go ahead and say that we are going to set the available resolutions and populate our drop-down with what's available. So what is available? Let's get our resolution array for the resolutions as screen.resolutions. Now, I'm also going to make a list where we can cache all these strings, and that list is something that we'll be able to add as the set of options on our dropdown. So let's make a new list string for options equals new list string, and then just go through all of the resolutions. The resolutions array is going to have the first elements as the smallest resolution available and the last one as the largest. So I'm actually going to start from the end and work my way back to the beginning. Since it'll be starting at around 1920 by 1080, I'd like that to be up front. So for int I equals, we're going to take it and set it as the resolutions.length minus 1. And as long as I is greater than or equal to 0, then we're going to subtract from I and work our way backwards through the list. And now we can say that options.add, and we're going to add a new string, which is going to be our resolutions I.width, and then put an X in between them, so it'll be like width by height, and then resolutions I.height. After we've got our array, we can go ahead and set that to our dropdown, but let's make sure we clear it first. So UI.resolutions.clear options, and then UI.resolutions.add options, and we're going to add all of the resolutions that we've just snagged. And now if I were to look at that dropdown, I now have a list of a bunch of different resolutions that I could set this game to. Now, that's really all the preparation that we need to make. So now we can go through and make it where we can start assigning these values. So when we click on a button, we can change a setting, that is universal for our visual novel, such as the full screen or windowed mode, and however we want our behavior to run when we're skipping and we reach a choice. Do we want to continue skipping after that or stop? As well as just general settings like the architect speed and the volumes in our games. So we're going to mess with the UI objects using their integrated functions like onClick or onValueChanged to change some different values, and we're going to need a different file specifically for our configuration where these values will be saved so they can be reloaded on start and saved whenever we make any changes. So to do that, we're going to create another class, which is going to be our VM configuration. So inside of the scripts folder, I'm going to go into the VM system and where we have our data containers, and I'm going to make another container in here, which will be for our configurations. Now, this stuff, what we have in here right now is for conversation and variable data, but it's all for the VM system. So I'm just going to create a new C# script and now make this VN configuration. This is different from the dialog system configuration inside of our configuration assets, because the dialog system configuration asset is configured with variables that don't change. You set these to change the overall behavior of how the dialog functions and what the default sizes and whatnot are, but the configuration of the visual novel is something that will be configurable from the menu and user editable. So with the VN configuration open, let's remove mono behavior, make sure that this class is a system.serializable, so we can write it to file, just like we did for our save files, then remove start and update. Now, just like for our save files, we're only going to have one opened at any given time, and we can reference that directly from the class to make it easy to see whatever kind of a config is applied here. So we can go ahead and make ourselves an instance with public static VN configuration instance, which will be get private set. And that's going to be assigned whenever we load a config. It'll be created and it will be the active one. Now, to save this thing to file, we're going to need some sort of default file path for our configuration. So we can make ourselves a public static string called file path and set this equal to some sort of path, which we can look at from our file paths manager, and specify the root, as this is the root for any sort of runtime files that we'll be creating. So root, and then we're also going to add something on top of that. So let me go ahead and encapsulate this inside of a string where I can add something to the end of it. So we get the root path, which, if we look at it, is the runtime path, so that would be assets or app data or what have you, followed by the game data folder. So after root, all I'm going to say is we're going to make this vn config.cfg, and that'll be our config file. And now let's go ahead and define the different variables that we can save here. So we're going to have some general settings. And inside of the general settings, the first thing that we'll look at is if we are on full screen or windowed mode. So we can represent this in a public boolean called display full screen. And by default, I'm going to set that to true, so the game will start in full screen mode. Now we've also got our display resolution, and that's really handled in a string as a width by height format. So I'll say public string and do display resolution, and that's going to equal my default resolution, which is 1920 by 1080. This is pretty standard across monitors now, so you'll be safe with this, but we'll also implement a way where having a wrong value set as the default resolution won't mess up the game. So we'll have a little safeguard in there in a minute. Now, do we want to continue skipping after we make a choice? Public bool continue skipping after choice equals false by default, and a float for our architect speed. So float dialog text speed, which is just the architect speed at which it renders text on screen. And of course the auto reader, we need that as well. So float the dialog auto read speed. It will be 1f by default as well. Now, how about the audio settings? Let's do some audio settings that we can set from those sliders on the audio menu. Let's go ahead and make the public float music volume, which will be represented in normalized format as 1. And we'll also do one for the sound effects and the voices. So I'll change music for sound effects and music for voices there. And also, in addition to the volume, we can also make a way where we can just click a button and mute each individual one, which is pretty common in visual novels as well. So public bool will go music mute equals false. And we'll do that for sound effects and voices as well. Just like that. And also there's another thing that we can change. In our history menu, when we bring up our logs, we can go ahead and change the size of the logs. So instead of having to do that every single time we launch up the novel, it'd be good to save that in our configuration as well. So public float history log scale, and that's going to equal 1 as well. So that's basically our settings that we have, and we can add more if we need them later on, but this is a good starting point. Now back in our config menu, as soon as we start up the game, let's go ahead and try to load up whatever configuration we have saved to file. So I'm going to make a private void called load config. And in start, after we assign the available resolutions, I'm going to go ahead and try to load the config for this thing. So when we load the configuration, we want to see if our configuration file exists, which we can do easily by checking if file, which is under the system.io namespace, if file.exists, what file are we looking for? We're looking for vn configuration.file path. If that file path exists, then we're going to basically load it into our system. Now, for our vn configuration, when we go to load a file, let's make a function in here that we can actually use to load whatever configuration is active. And that will take all of the settings from the file and apply them to the visual novel and all of the UI elements that would be on screen. So for the config that would be open, let's go ahead and make a public void called load. And I'm going to change instance to active config, just so it's a little more clear that is the active configuration file. So back in config menu, here's what we'll do. We'll go ahead and say vn underscore configuration.activeconfig equals file manager.load. And we're going to be saving this thing the same way that we saved our save file, which means we load it the same way too. We load it as a vn configuration object, and we specify the vn configuration.file path as the path, and encryption would be specified here, whether we want to encrypt the config or not. I'm going to leave that as false for right now because we may go looking at that and just make sure that everything is right. Which, if I'm assigning it this way, I am going to have that where anything can really assign it. So that way the active config can be applied from our config menu here. If that file does not exist, then vn configuration.activeconfig equals new vn configuration. We'll create a very new one. But regardless of which one we have, now let's go ahead and say vn configuration.activeconfig.load. And let's load whatever the settings are into the visual novel. So we've got our load function, and if we want to save this to file, let's also make a public void called save. And when we're running this game, if ever we quit it, I want to go ahead and save that configuration. So I'll go ahead and do a private void on application quit, which will be called when we close the application that's been exported from Unity. And when we do this, I'll just reference vn configuration.activeconfig.save, and we'll go ahead and write it to file. All that's going to do is we're going to reference file manager.save, and we'll go ahead and save to the file path, and referencing this, but it needs to be encrypted into JSON data, not encrypted, but converted. So we'll say JSON utility dot to JSON this. And again, we would specify if we want to encrypt it here. So since that's two places I would put it, I'll make a constant which will tell me if we encrypt these files or not. Public constant boolean encrypt equals false for right now. And so encrypt will just equal whatever that value is. Back in config manager, as we go ahead and we load this thing as well, then I'll say that encrypt equals vn configuration dot encrypt. So we can decide whether we want to save and load this as an encrypted file or not, and protect our data from tampering. Now, as for when we load the configuration, we're going to have some default settings which we've already applied inside of the configuration itself, but one thing that we need to do is not only apply this to the visual novel settings, but we need to apply it to the UI elements as well. So our config menu has all of these different UI items, and they need to be updated with whatever was in our config panel. Otherwise, we're going to set the values inside of the engine, but our UI is going to display something totally different. So we're going to need access to all of these UI items, so that way we can set the right values. Now we can do that one of two ways. We can either give access to the config menu for the VN configuration file, or we can give access just to the UI items. Either way, we're going to need a static instance of something, that way it can be accessed directly within our VN configuration. So if we wanted to give just our UI items, which is only those buttons, then we could make a static UI items field inside of VN configuration. But I'm going to go ahead and give it access to the whole config menu in case there's something that we need later on. So I will make that a instance inside of config menu, since we'll only have one in the game at any given time, and it's not going to be something that is set in do not destroy on load, so we'll always only have the instance that is for each given scene. And when we load a new scene, that instance will just be overridden. So let me go ahead and define void awake and have that ready. So let's make a public static config menu for the instance, which will be get private set. And in awake, instance equals this. And since the VN configuration needs access to UI items, I'm going to change that from private to public. Now, in the VN configuration, for my buttons in particular, I want to know which one is active. Such as full screen and continue skipping, these have two buttons that are given for them. One for full screen, one for windowed, and one for continue skipping, and one for stop skipping. So I need to change the color of whichever one is the active selected choice. So down in the UI items, if we come back to the config menu, let's go ahead and add a function which will change the color of the buttons. So I'm going to make a public void called set button colors, which will take button A and button B. And I'll also have a boolean called selected A. And that will be true only if A is the one that should be selected. Otherwise, B is going to receive the color that we're applying here. So let's go ahead and define what the active color for the buttons are. I'll define that right up above here in a private static color for button selected color, which will equal a new color. And if it's selected, I want it to be kind of an orangish, almost magenta color. So we'll go 1 on the red value, 0.3 or 3.5, somewhat on green, 0 on blue, 1 on alpha. And a button unselected color will be that kind of dark gray. So we can make this a 0.25 on all of them. So 0.25 for all the colors, or all the values. Now, I did decide to add two more values here, so we will change the button background color as well as the text color. So that way we can, make sure that the buttons don't just stay white and it's only the text changing. So the button, when it's selected, is going to be that orangish color. When it's not selected, it'll be plain white or whatever its default color is. For the text, when it's selected, it's going to be yellow. That'll pair decently with our orange look. And if it's unselected, then the text will remain in its dark color. So when we set the button colors, we're going to set both the text and the actual button. Now, so this gets applied to all of the colors that are on our button, which would be for whether we click it, hover over it, take our mouse off, or whatever. We need to change the color of the image, not the button. So the image is just attached to the button. So we could say a.getComponent image.color equals one of these colors. So we'll check if it's selected A, then we're going to choose button selected color or button unselected color if it's false. Let's duplicate this and just change that to B and look for if we are not selected A. Then we'll use selected color or unselected color. Cool. Now let's go down and let's just copy that, paste it, and do it for the text. So that will be a Text Mesh Pro UGUI component for both of these. So now we're getting their text components. And we'll set the color, instead of button selected color, to text selected color. And all we need to do is replace button for text, and we have the correct values. So if we select button A, then that A button is going to be orange with yellow text. Otherwise, it's going to have the default colors. So when we come and load our VM configuration, let's go ahead and snag the UI elements of the config menu. So var UI equals config menu.instance.ui. And now we can go ahead and apply the general settings. This will be both to the UI and to the actual game. So let's go ahead and set the window size first of all. So let's go ahead and say screen, get our screen, full screen, which is how we control whether this is full screen or windowed on the application itself. This won't be something we can see in the editor, but once we export it, then it will work for us. That will equal the display full screen, whether that is true or false. And then config menu, or actually we've already got our UI, we'll say UI.setButtonColors to make sure that we know which one it is that we're on. So our first button is going to be UI.fullScreen. Second one will be UI.windowed. Those are our two choices. And we will select full screen, which would be selected A, only if display full screen is true. Now, let's go ahead and try to load this and see what we come up with. So, if we go to the config menu, well, we can see the button is selected, but I get a null reference because I think I tried to get the text off of the button itself and not its children. If I just make sure to say get component in children instead, then we'll go ahead and grab the right component for our text. So now let's go ahead and load up config. There we go. We have full screen, which is showing that it is selected. And if I were to just reverse this real quick so we could see what would happen if it wasn't selected, then of course what happens is a window then gets shown that it's selected. Again, I'll iterate that UI design, color choices, animations, whatever, all comes down to personal preference. I'm mainly showing how to link up all this stuff together and make it obvious what's selected, but if you want to pretty it up, then this would be the time to figure out how you want to do that, so that way it's not really a hassle to go back and do later. Now let's go ahead and set the screen resolution for our dropdown. So let's go ahead and loop through all of the options that are available since they will have been retrieved before this file is supposed to be loaded. So with all those options now available inside of the resolutions dropdown, we can simply iterate through that and find the one that matches our display resolution that's saved in the file, and then make sure that that is the one that's set on the dropdown. So in case we have a bad value for some reason that's been cached in here, let's go ahead and just cache a resolution index, which would be the index of the option inside of the dropdown. And if we don't find a match, then it just goes ahead and defaults to 0. So, which would be the first one inside of the dropdown. So let's call this our res index and set that to 0. Now let's go ahead and loop for int I equals 0 while I is less than ui.resolutions.options.count I plus plus, and we go through every one of them. Now let's go ahead and grab the resolution for this current option as ui.resolutions.options.i.text. And let's do a check. If resolution equals our display resolution, then we know we found a match, and we can say that res index equals I. And we could even go ahead and break at this point. So we break out of the for loop and we go ahead and apply it. So after that is done, we finished our loop, and now let's go ahead and say that ui.resolutions.set value, and we can set it without notify, which just wouldn't trigger any kind of onChanged event, and set it to the resolution index. So if we open up our config menu, we can see that we are at 1920 by 1080 out of all these choices, which isn't any different from where we were to begin with, but remember 19 by 1080 is our default option. And as our display resolution in the config is set to initialize at 19 by 1080, we're not seeing any kind of difference there. Now, we can't really change this file or this number and see a change, because if you went ahead and said on application quit, then save the config, then what we're doing is we've now generated a file with those values, and we're going to load it each and every time. So changing it from configuration is not going to make a difference unless we delete that file, or we simply load up a new one. What we can do is we can edit the file that's already been created. That would go in our root directory, which is app data and game data, and now we have this vnconfig file. So if I open this up, then we'll be able to edit what is inside of it. So I'm just going to go ahead, say view word wrap, so that way I can see everything, and this is our config file as it is. We can see that our display resolution is set to 1920 by 1080. Now I'm going to change this so we can see if it is affecting our dropdown. 1366 by 768 was one of the options available to me. So if I go ahead and save this, and then relaunch Unity, we should see that the default option has changed. So load up config, and there it sure is, 1366 by 768. Now how do we actually apply that resolution to the screen though? Because this is only being applied to the dropdown. We'll go ahead and do this from within our config menu. Our config menu is going to have different functions that all of our buttons and UI elements can call. So at the very bottom, I'm going to go ahead and make these UI callable functions. The first one we'll say is a public void called set display to full screen. And we'll have a boolean called full screen. And if that is true, then we'll say screen.fullscreen equals full screen. So to unify this inside of our VN configuration, I'm now just going to say that config menu.instance.set display to full screen, passing in our full screen mode, which was called display full screen. Basically does the same thing, but just unifying it to run through the config menu like our buttons will do. And to set the display resolution, what we're going to do is make a new public void called set display resolution. This one won't take any kind of value because we'll read it from the config file. Or rather, we'll read it from the UI element that's been changed. So let's go ahead and say that string resolution equals UI.resolutions, and we can just access the current one that's selected by saying caption text.text, and that'll get us whatever option is currently selected. So now we can just split the width by the height. So string values equals resolution.split by x, which will get us our width and our height. It needs to be a string array, and then we're good. So let's go ahead and say if int.try parse, we need to try parse values 0 out to an integer called width, and int.try parse values 1 out to an integer called height. If that is true, we have ourselves a valid width and height configuration set up. Else, we can go ahead and debug.log error and say that we did not have a valid option here. If we have an invalid one, I'm going to say that we couldn't parse it into a width and height format. Otherwise, we can go ahead and say screen.setResolution, and we're going to set the width to the width, the height to the height, and full screen to whatever our full screen mode would be, and that would be inside of our configuration. So, but it's also applied to our screen.fullScreen variable, which is, it's already in effect on our screen, so we can just reference it right there. And we also want to update the display resolution inside of our config file when we do this. So vn configuration.activeconfig.display resolution equals the resolution. Since we may be referencing this a lot, it'd be good to go ahead and set this to a variable called config up above, where we can say private vn configuration config simply points to the active config on screen. And then we can just say config.displayResolution equals resolution. So in our vn configuration, when we load, after we set this value, if we attach it to the button itself or the dropdown, then simply setting the value will go ahead and set both the value and call the function that is attached to the dropdown. So UIResolutions.value could equal resolution index, and we will go ahead and set the value and set the display on screen at the same time. In order to do that, in Unity, we just need to link up those functions. So let's go ahead to our display with our buttons, which this one is for my full screen. I'm just going to go ahead and rename that to full screen. And my second one was windowed here, which just controls the window mode of the application. I'll control both of them. On click, I'm going to reference the config menu and select config menu dot set display to full screen. Now, windowed is going to be false, but full screen is going to be true. And for the resolution, I'll select the drop down and choose on value changed. And on value changed will reference config, config menu, set display resolution, and save. Now, if we run this in Unity, go back to config and toggle between window and full screen mode, well, first of all, you can see that the buttons don't change colors. So let's go ahead and fix that real quick. The only thing we need to do there is reference UI.setButtonColors and set UI.fullScreen and UI.windowed to whatever the full screen variable is. And then we can go ahead and see that we can toggle between windowed and full screen. But like I said, that doesn't change anything in editor mode, only in the exported application. And our resolution can be changed as well. But of course, that doesn't change it in the editor, just in the exported application. But if we were to run this as an exported application, then we could indeed change to windowed mode, back to full screen, and set our resolutions, and then everything will seem to work just fine. Now, I'll go ahead and set the other options for the things that are available to us as well. So after resolution, we had the option to continue skipping after making choices. So let's make a public void, continue, or set continue skipping after choice, bool continue skipping, and then we'll say config dot continue skipping after choice equals continue skipping. Next thing we had was a slider for our text architect speed. So public void set text architect speed. And we can say config dot dialog text speed. We'll go ahead and say that this is going to equal UI dot architect speed dot value, and we'll do the same thing for the auto reader speed. Set the auto reader speed config dot dialog auto read speed equals UI dot auto reader speed dot value. And our sliders are fine, but we just need to make sure that the buttons change their colors for when we change this continue skipping value. So we can say UI set button colors and specify UI dot continue skipping and UI dot stop skipping to whatever our continue skipping value is. Again, making sure that UI skipping continue is the first one because this boolean decides whether A is active or B is active. So that should be good enough. And inside of the VN configuration, after we set the resolution, we can also go ahead and set the color of the button to whatever is cached inside of the configuration file. And additionally, we can go ahead and make sure that our architect speed and auto reader speed gets set to whatever is cached in the file as well when it gets loaded. And so for our skip buttons, let's make sure that the continue and stop button both have an on-click entry, which goes to our config menu, where we can go ahead and say, we will set continue skipping after choice, where continue will be true and stop will be false. And for both the text speed and the auto read speed, let's grab their sliders and make sure they have an on value changed entry and set that to our config menu and go to config menu, set text architect speed. But for the auto read speeder, let's make sure that that is set to set auto reader speed. Now we can go ahead and change any settings that we want on this general menu, and it'll all be saved into that file. But let's go ahead and get these options working. Let's go ahead and start with the skipping behavior. After we hit a choice, we should check the config and see if we need to continue skipping or stop skipping after a choice. For that, we're going to need access to the auto reader since that handles both the auto reading and the skipping. So we can just change this from private to public since we'll want to access that elsewhere, but make sure we can only publicly retrieve it and privately assign it, so that way we can't just go changing things. And let's go down to the initialization feature, because now this line won't work since we can't cast out to a retrieval variable like we have up above, that getter and setter. So let's say that auto reader equals get component auto reader, and if our auto reader is not equal to null, then we're going to initialize it and make sure it's ready for us. And now, since we want to do this for our choices, we can come into the logical line for the choices, and right in the execute function, after we have made the choice, we go through and we enqueue the next conversation, so at this point we can go through and check and see if we need to stop skipping if it's currently running. The way we can do that is we can cache our auto reader as the auto reader that comes from our dialog system.instance.auto reader, which is now available to us. And now let's go ahead and check, just in case maybe we're not using auto reader, which if you're not going to use it, maybe you can just not use the script at all. But if you have it as an option and you want to check, if auto reader is not equal to null, meaning we have one, and auto reader dot is on, so it's on and it's either reading or skipping, and auto reader dot skip, then we know that we may potentially need to stop this thing. So let's check our configuration. So if not vn configuration dot active config dot continue skipping after choice, then we need to say auto reader dot disable and go ahead and stop it. So that way, if we choose to stop skipping after a choice, it'll go ahead and take care of that after it finishes executing the logical line. And now with my config set to stop skipping after the choice, let's go ahead and skip, roll all the way through, we make it to the choice, and click it, and now it is no longer skipping. And of course I could manually start it again. Whereas if we flip that around and say continue skipping, then we can go ahead and launch the skip for the auto reader, make it to the choice, click our choice, and it keeps on going. Note, for this to work, you're going to need to have the VN configuration active config loaded in the scene at this time. Otherwise, you could do a check and just make sure if VN configuration.active config is not equal to null, and we have the continue skipping after choice. Otherwise, maybe we haven't loaded a config, maybe you're just in some sort of test screen, test scene, whatever. and then we don't want it to throw any errors, so we can check if it's null and then go ahead and look for the value. So if we go back to our config menu, we have onApplicationQuit, which is called whenever we stop the Unity application. Now if we're running that in the actual exported application, then it's going to restart all of our static variables automatically, including our active config. That will be null the next time we restart. However, if we run this in the editor, then it won't clear out any static variables unless we reload. So we could just to say if maybe we're like switching between scenes, some that may use a config, some that may not, like testing scenes or what have you, we can go ahead and reset that by saying vnconfiguration.activeconfig equals null, and that'll make sure that we go ahead and set this to be nothing once we exit the game, but when we load it, we're going to load whatever was saved. We only have to do that because inside of the Unity editor, the static variables will persist. So if we don't want that, just reset it. If it doesn't matter, leave it alone, and no harm done. Next thing we can do from our config menu is change the speed of the text architect. Now we can do that pretty easily just by saying that we want our dialog_system.instance.conversationmanager.architect. Since the architect is contained in the conversation manager, we can access its speed variable and set that to equal whatever our dialog text speed is. Now that speed, if we look at it, is actually the speed multiplier, which gets multiplied by whatever our base speed is. So if we go ahead and change that value, we can change how fast our text appears on screen. One thing I might want to do is access the slider and just change the minimum and maximum values. Obviously, I don't want the speed to be 0 because then no text would ever show up. So maybe 0.1, and maybe the max value could be 2, so we can go double speed. And then if I go ahead and load up the config, then my text speed will be, let's go ahead and set it in the middle to be 1, so we shouldn't notice any real difference. There goes the text, so if we change it to fast, let's go ahead and look. That's a little faster, but let me take it down to slow, all the way to the end. We should see it go real slow. There we are. So maybe we'll go a little faster than 2. Maybe I'll set the max value to something like 5. And then if I set it to fast, then let's go ahead and see how that is. That's pretty fast, yeah. Go a little down the middle of the road, so about there. Still pretty quick. So yeah, if we wanted to, we can control that based off of an animation curve, and then get some precise scaling to our speed. I think I'll go ahead and change the max value to 4, and leave it at that. So that leaves the last thing as our autoreader speed. So what we can do for the autoreader is we can go ahead and see if we have one on the dialog system. Say autoreader equals dialog system.instance.autoreader. And if autoreader is not equal to null, then we'll go ahead and say that autoreader.speed equals the config.dialog autoread speed. Again, speed is just a public variable inside of the autoreader that gets divided in the time to read when we're actually looking to see how long we need to wait for once this line finishes to when the next one will start to build. Again, as a reminder, the autoreader does not build text, it simply watches for the text architect, and once it's done, it estimates the time to read that line and then automatically advances to the next line without the player having to click manually and try to go there. So by increasing the speed, we should lower that time, and then lines will come and go on a faster pace, for more fast-paced readers. Same thing, I'll take the slider for the auto-read speed, set the max value to 4, and the minimum value to, I think, something like 0.1. And then if the auto-read speed is about 1, then let's go ahead and set it to auto. Not soon after the storm worsened, the sky began to let down a deluge as the lightning crackled above. And so we're waiting. That's a fairly casual pace. If we wanted to go faster, then we would just go ahead and wait for the next line to start. It's in the village, hurry, we're almost there. The excitement filled their breath and fueled their steps. Yeah, so this would be for a very fast reader. But you can go ahead and change that down with this value now. So now we have control of the display size, the resolution, the skipping behavior, the text speed, and auto-read speed. Next thing we have to do is the audio settings, but we'll do that in the next episode because this one's getting fairly long. So we'll go ahead and stop here, and I'll see you guys in the next one.